Mosaic, a daily news program from Link TV, presents a selection of news reports from independent and state-controlled broadcasters from throughout the Middle East.
The wave of anger in the Islamic world has escalated after a Danish newspaper published offensive caricatures of the Prophet Mohammed, peace be upon him. The increased wave of anger and public condemnation forced some governments to take measures against the economic interests of Denmark, which has refused to offer an apology to Muslims.
ضد المصالح الاقتصادية للدنمارك التي رفضت تقديم اعتذار للمسلمين.
Strong anger was felt in Arab and Islamic streets as a result of the newspaper Jylland-Posten publishing 12 caricatures defaming the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and portraying him as a terrorist. The Copenhagen newspaper and government justified this act as a freedom of expression, which distinguishes this country as a leader compared to others. Both have refused, since the publication of the pictures last September, to apologize to Muslims. Also, Denmark Prime Minister Anders Fogh Rasmussen has refused to meet a delegation of Muslims from the country as the anger has increased, and Rasmussen was widely criticized for justifying his government's actions. He met with some Arab and Muslim leaders, most recently the Afghani president, which was transformed into a defense of the Danish government.
الذي تحول إلى مدافع عن الحكومة الدنماركية.
Prime Minister Rasmussen explained Denmark's position, which is very satisfactory to me as a Muslim. The reality is that the press is free here.
Free here as we now.
The pictures were also republished in a Norwegian newspaper, which was the last straw to break the camel's back. A wave of anger exploded in Arab and Muslim cities and capitals. In an official position with the public sentiment, Libya closed its embassy in Copenhagen, and Saudi Arabia recalled its ambassador from Denmark. These actions were crystallized at the public level with an initiative to boycott Danish products. Consumers were receptive to the boycott message. The scenes of anger could also be seen in public demonstrations in Mauritania and in the Palestinian territories. The protesters burned the Danish flag, and those who were able to control themselves sent a message to the government of Denmark.
We demand that all the Arab and Muslim countries withdraw their ambassadors from Denmark for their insults, and we demand that all our people, our heroes, to respond by boycotting Danish products.
The Danish authorities, which oversaw the defamation of the greatest and most honored prophets, could not tolerate the scene of its own flag being burned and stepped on. The Danish Prime Minister said that he will communicate with his European counterparts to come up with an exit out of this crisis, which will remain as a blot of shame in the history of humanity.
And dressing as a woman.
German Chancellor Angela Merkel would become today the first foreign leader to meet Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas since Hamas won last week's parliamentary election. Merkel said she would use her talks to put pressure on the Palestinian Authority to ensure that Hamas would recognize Israel's right to exist, renounce violence, and honor previous agreements between the Palestinians and Israelis. Her visit comes as EU foreign ministers were to meet in Brussels to discuss the implementation of the dramatic Hamas victory. The details with Yumna Tayara.
Israel was looking towards the international community today to increase the pressure on Hamas following its election victory. EU foreign ministers were holding meetings to discuss the implication of Hamas's win, the Islamist group who is committed to Israel's destruction and have carried out dozens of suicide attacks during a 5-year uprising. Diplomatic sources said the EU was unlikely to take any rash decisions until the composition of a new Palestinian government. President Mahmoud Abbas remained in overall charge. Abbas was preparing to head to Gaza for for talks with Hamas leaders, whom he would ask to form a new government. Following talks with visiting German Chancellor Angela Merkel, acting Premier Ehud Olmert said Israel would not hand over customs duties owed to the Palestinian Authority until it was satisfied that they would not end up in the hands of, quote, terrorists. Merkel, who was meeting Abbas in Ramallah today, warned it would be unthinkable for Brussels to continue to fund the authority if Hamas does not renounce violence against Israel. Following a meeting with Israeli President Moshe Katsav, Merkel said that Abbas had a very big responsibility and an important contribution to make in terms of encouraging Hamas to change. Her talks with Abbas would come one day after she and Israel's acting Prime Minister Olmert made a joint pledge not to deal with Hamas until it recognized Israel's right to exist and renounce violence. For his part, Katsav denied that Abbas was in a weaker position since the election and said his country wanted no escalation. Israel, appalled at the prospect of a Palestinian government led by a group calling for its destruction and responsible for scores of suicide attacks, started an international campaign to see Hamas isolated. Merkel said Hamas could not be granted international legitimacy just because it won the election, and said she would convey Germany's position to the European Union, the biggest donor to the cash-strapped Palestinian Authority.
ونبقى مع التطورات الفلسطينية فقد احتل نحو
In other developments, nearly 40 Palestinian policemen occupied the rooftops of the building complex that includes the Palestinian Legislative Parliament in Gaza, vowing to prevent the Islamic resistance movement Hamas from taking over control of the Palestinian security services.
لم يدخلوا مبنى المجلس بحد ذاته النار في الهواء وأكدوا أنهم مستعدون للتحرك لمنع حركة حماس.
The policemen who did not enter the building fired shots into the air and confirmed that they were prepared to prevent Hamas from controlling the security services. After 1 hour, the policemen ended their protest on the rooftops when senior police officials intervened to stop the protest at the Palestinian Legislative Council.
التي هيمنت على الحياة السياسية الفلسطينية لعقود.
A number of the Palestinian security officers remain loyal to the Fatah movement, which dominated the political scene for decades.
بسيارة مفخخة في هجوم استهدف مقر للشرطة في الناصرية.
In light of Hamas's landslide victory in the Palestinian legislative elections, the Islamic resistance movement has confirmed that it will hold a series of talks with Arab officials in a number of Arab countries, including Egypt, where the Israeli Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni is also scheduled to arrive in Egypt later in the week. To shed light on the role that Egypt may play in this recent development, we are joined from Cairo by Ahmed Al-Muslimani, a political analyst in the Al-Ahram newspaper. Mr. Ahmed, is it possible that Egypt has the key to resolve the recent crisis?
كبيرة للغاية وبالتالي فإن المفاتيح صعبة عموما بعضها داخل القاهرة وبعضها خارج القاهرة لكن فيما يخص مصر وحركة حماس.
This crisis is very big and solutions are very limited. Some answers may be found in Cairo. Another solution can be located elsewhere. However, there are three issues involved regarding Egypt's future relations with Hamas. Firstly, Hamas is not strange to the Egyptian government. In fact, a number of its prominent and high-ranking leaders have visited Egypt in many occasions in recent months and years. Secondly, Egypt has two exits out of this crisis caused by Hamas' victory, which could also have positive effects. First exit is the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas. When all doors are closed off and issues are deadlocked, eyes will be focused on the Palestinian president for a way out. The second exit is the Arab League and its Secretary General, Amr Moussa. The Arab League can spare the Egyptian government an embarrassment because it does not recognize the Muslim Brotherhood, and now it is compelled to recognize Hamas after taking over the Palestinian Authority in a democratic way.
This is taking place while the European Union adopted a position to isolate Hamas politically and financially. Do you see a better policy of dealing with this crisis?
مصر لديها مأزق في هذا الموضوع. محاصرة حماس هو جزء من هدف الحكومة المصرية في محاصرة حركة
Egypt is caught in between a rock and a hard place. Isolating Hamas is part of the Egyptian government's plan to isolate the Muslim Brotherhood nationally and internationally, especially the so-called International Organization for the Muslim Brotherhood, which Hamas is considered to be one of its most important wings. Similarly, the European Union and the American stand of isolating the movement will hurt the interests of the Palestinian people people and will further escalate the security crisis in the occupied territories. Thus, Egypt is faced with a dilemma. On one side, the Egyptian government supports isolating the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. At the same time, Egypt finds itself having to give Hamas a chance. Egypt plans to pressure Hamas to change its manifesto, so it will no longer call for revolution and armed struggle, but rather for a non-armed struggle that respects political rules. Hamas is being transformed from a revolutionary movement into a government, and slogan, Islam is the solution, will be put on the back burner so it can deal with the urgent water, education, health and housing problems, as well as the problems of paying government employees.
إلى دورات الماء والكهرباء والتعليم والصحة والإسكان ومرتبات الموظفين وما إلى ذلك من أمور الدنيا وليست فقط من أمور.
في موضوع آخر، دعا القيادي في حركة المقاومة الإسلامية حماس إسماعيل
Haniya, a Hamas senior official, has urged the four-panel International Committee on the Middle East to hold direct and unconditional dialogue with the Islamic resistance movement. He also called on the committee to continue its financial support of the Palestinians and to understand their priorities at this difficult time. This will help stabilize the already tense region.
رغبة منا في حركة المقاومة الإسلامية حماس والتي حازت على أغلبية في انتخابات المجلس التشريعي.
We at the Islamic Resistance Movement, which has won a landslide victory in the Palestinian legislative elections, hereby extend our hand to cooperate and work together with all people and institutions of the free world. Today we send a message to you, asking that you deal with it with an open mind and with a great deal of responsibility. We plead to all people and countries of the free world to respect the election results and the Palestinians' choice and to deal with the Palestinian problem accordingly. We also call on the four-panel International Committee to hold open and unconditional dialogue with Hamas with a great deal of objectivity and fairness.
والتعامل مع الشعب الفلسطيني على هذا الأساس. ثانياً
We are still committed to our platform and agenda of political change and reform. We will implement every aspect of this program with a great deal of transparency, especially in the areas of financial and public administration, and in accordance with legal codes and correct principles.
هو برنامج التغيير والإصلاح ونحن متجهون إلى تنفيذه بكل إرادة وشفافية.
We seek to build a political system that is based on sharing authority, prompting democracy, and respecting human rights. All will be in accordance with the law. In light of the above-mentioned statements, we urge you to take into consideration priorities of the Palestinian people, especially in this difficult time. We ask you to continue your financial assistance and heartfelt support to the Palestinians in order to spare the region any further security deterioration and instability. We also appeal to you to continue your financial aid to the Palestinians, asking you to forward all pledges to the General Fund of the Palestinian Ministry of the Treasury. Spending will be prioritized in accordance to the people's needs. We are in dire need to build and develop the status quo of our nation. We reassure you that all financial pledges and aid will be spent on government employees' wages and salaries, daily general expenditures, and on building our nation's infrastructure. And you can make sure of that by checking certain data systems that will be agreed upon.
وبإمكانكم التأكد من ذلك عبر الآليات التي يتم التوافق عليها.
Jewish residents of Hebron agreed today to evacuate homes in the city's open-air market. This after a compromise was reached with security forces. According to the agreement, settlers will be allowed to return to live in homes in the market within 60 days if they reach a rental agreement with the Hebron municipality. Dan Diker reports.
Seeking to avoid potentially violent clashes between settlers and security forces, the government has acceded to a compromise agreement ahead of tomorrow's ordered evacuation of the Hebron open-air market. According to the arrangement, senior security officials promised that the evacuated homes would not be transferred to Palestinians until the ownership battle is settled in the courts. Settlers had petitioned the High Court, claiming Jewish ownership over a cluster of homes they had been occupying in the town's open market. Security officials and settler leaders agreed that Jewish families would also keep the keys to their former dwellings until the end of the legal process.
We got this property from the ancestors of the Jewish community of Hebron. This is our land.
National Religious Party faction head MK Shaul Yalom said the compromise proves that it is possible to solve such disputes rationally rather than by force, and that the same should be done to solve the disagreements surrounding the illegal outpost of Amona, also slated to be evacuated this week. But ranking Labour Party member and former GSS security head Ami Ayalon today blasted the compromise, accusing the government of capitulating to settler violence. Despite the compromise proposal, the defense establishment is still preparing to use force if necessary. Thousands of police officers and soldiers are expected to take part in the evacuation should some settlers ultimately defy the agreement and remain in the Hebron market. Dan Diker, IBA News.
U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice has arrived in London for a special session of the International Quartet on the repercussions of the Palestinian elections. Rice and her counterparts from the European Union, Russia, and the United Nations, who are the backers of the roadmap peace proposal, must now decide how to deal with Hamas. Rice admitted to reporters aboard her plane that the U.S. administration had failed to predict the Hamas victory. Rice presented a tough stand toward Hamas, saying the United States is not prepared to fund an organization that advocates the destruction of Israel and ignores its obligations. At the same time, Rice said humanitarian help to the Palestinians should be dealt with on a case-by-case basis. EU Foreign Secretary Jack Straw said that the Hamas must clarify its political intentions. Until then, said Straw, the EU will take a wait-and-see approach toward future economic aid to the PA.
On Hamas, what we'll be discussing is the aftermath of the election. It was, we understand, a democratic election. There's not an argument with those who voted for Hamas. However, there is a big choice now before Hamas as an organization. For elections and democracy entail responsibility. First of all, a responsibility to the democratic principle. You cannot have violence and democracy at the same time. So we're looking to Hamas to renounce violence. We also want to see Hamas recognize the reality of the two-state solution endorsed by the Security Council of the United Nations. And they're going to have to deal with the government of Israel if they want to deliver many of the welfare things they say they want to deliver to their own people. So that's a big issue.
American lawyers from the Center for Constitutional Rights are exerting efforts on behalf of the families of Yemeni detainees in Guantanamo, strengthening trust between them and briefing them on the latest developments in prisoners' court cases.
Amidst anticipation and hope for the return of their absent loving father who was detained as a result of the war on terror, these two children, Mohamed and Abdullah, live in an atmosphere of sadness and grief, waiting for news about their father who is in the Guantanamo prison.
After September 11th, they grabbed all the men and the families there. They accused them and took them.
When they took him, what was he doing?
He's a traitor. He was working.
The mother of Salman is waiting for news of her son. Any news is a breath of hope that renews her will to live until she sees her missing son, Salman.
The
families of the Yemeni detainees held in the American prisons gathered in Sana'a because they all have loved ones that are missing and being mistreated in Guantanamo. Meanwhile, they try to build trust between themselves and the American lawyers who are tasked with defending the prisoners in this terrible prison.
They gave us a general picture about the conditions of the detainees. The conditions are bad with regards to the facilities, services, and what's there. They portrayed the American prison guards as harsh and oppressive. They don't deal with tenderness and mercy. They are not good people. They portrayed the prisoners as having nothing but patience. They have to bear it.
During their meeting with the families of the detainees, the American lawyers in the Center for Constitutional Rights and local human rights organizations confirmed that legal procedures are continuing despite resistance to applying American laws and the lack of cooperation of some Arab governments.
ربما حقيقة تكون اليمن البحرين إلى حد ما
Perhaps Yemen and Bahrain are the only countries that have organizations that are following the case of the Guantanamo detainees better than any other countries. I can say with certainty that there is no cooperation from Arab governments. The opposite is happening. They are scaring their families.
Amidst continued arrests and humiliation, the families of the detainees pay a heavy price. Aswan al-Qatibi, Al-Alam Television, Sana'a.
The Afghan government set a period of time for foreign delegations and security forces to remove security barriers near their offices and buildings in Kabul, which have caused traffic congestion and added to residents' daily hardships. The same institutions, however, did not feel the government's announcement was intended for them.
The capital of Afghanistan, Kabul, which used to be able to accommodate only 1 million people, is now host to more than 4 million, in addition to thousands of non-governmental organizations, diplomatic missions, and American military compounds. The American Army has made Kabul its primary base from which to resume its operations throughout the rest of Afghanistan, as security declined in other states. To add insult to injury, these security blocks and barriers have been erected by delegations and organizations that supposedly came to this country to maintain peace and security. They are meant to protect the lives of foreign workers in their compounds. This compelled the Afghan government to set a time limit of 1 week for these barriers to be removed.
This time limit, ordered by the government to the Ministry of Interior or to some of the offices in Kabul to remove the barriers along the main roads, will be discussed after forming permanent committees in the parliament. Until now, no, it has not entered the scope of discussion. However, after the committees are formed, this issue will be discussed because it's a serious problem affecting the Afghan people.
Heavy traffic and waiting long hours in traffic jams became daily occurrences in Kabul, thus negatively affecting the morale of the Afghanis and their daily activities. They have been demanding of the government to take more decisive and strict measures to remove these obstacles from public roads and to reopen the roads that have been closed off to ordinary citizens.
All the roads are closed off, which caused this traffic congestion, forcing citizens to wait for hours. When will this problem be solved?
The time limit that was set by the Afghani government to remove security barriers has fallen on deaf ears, especially by the American bases and UN institutions that feel the government's announcement was intended for them. Some even threaten to stop their operations if the Afghani government insists on the removal of these barriers. The Afghani government confirms that it's serious in its decision to remove these security barriers to ease traffic congestion, but foreign military bases and UN institutions feel that they should not be included in this decision.
The African Union will call on the United Nations to make an exception in its arms embargo on Somalia to allow foreign peacekeepers into the country to help the interim government. The East African nation has been without central government since 1991. An interim administration formed in neighboring Kenya returned last year but has limited control over the country. Some East African states have said they would be willing to contribute peacekeepers, but Somali officials say the United Nations would need to lift an arms embargo before any foreign soldiers could be deployed. Somali presidential envoy Abdirashid said that the decision could also pave the way for peacekeepers from outside Africa to come to Somalia.
The party of Ivory Coast President Laurent Gbagbo said on Monday it was rejoining the transitional government it had quit last week in a spat over a UN-backed peace group's call for parliament to step down. The Ivorian Popular Front, FPI, said it had decided to resume the country's peace process and, in consequence, its ministers would be returning to the cross-party government of Prime Minister Charles Konan Banny. The FPI claimed victory following 4 days of protest by pro-Gbagbo young patriots who erected barricades on the streets of Abidjan and tried to storm the headquarters of the United Nations peacekeeping force in Abidjan. It rejected as an attack on national sovereignty the recommendation by the International Working Group for the dissolution of parliament, which the FPI dominates. The UN-mandated group, which is overseeing Ivory Coast's shaky peace process, had recommended the move because the parliament's official 5-year term of office had expired in December 2005. The International Working Group is trying, through Banny's government, to reunify the West African country, which has been divided since an abortive coup against Gbagbo in 2002 and staged elections by October this year. Last week's 4-day protest was called off after Nigeria's President Olusegun Obasanjo, the current head of the African Union, flew to Abidjan for talks with Gbagbo and Banny amid hints by the UN that it could seek sanctions against Ivory Coast. He declared afterwards that the working group had no power to dissolve parliament, had not done so, and had no intention of doing so. Gbagbo's term of office also ran out in October 2005, with no arrangements made for presidential elections. Nigerian militants holding 4 foreign hostages disassociated themselves on Monday from bounty hunters, talking with the government on their behalf, and said that the captive oil workers would not be released. Government officials had on Sunday raised hopes of a release soon after receiving a recent photograph of the hostages at a meeting with a person they believed was a credible go-between with the militants. The hostages were abducted from an offshore oil field on January 11 by militants who have demanded the release of 2 ethnic Hamas leaders and waged a month-long campaign of sabotage against pipelines and platforms in the world's 8th largest oil exporter. Nigerian oil output has fallen by 10%. Zimbabwe's government has branded as hostile a warning by a US-based famine monitoring group that the country faces worsening food supply problems. Zimbabwe has faced 5 years of food shortages that critics say have been exacerbated by President Robert Mugabe's government's seizures of land from white farmers, but which Mugabe blames on drought. In its latest monthly report, the US-based Famine Early Warning System Network, FuseNet, said shortages of seeds, fertilizers, and fuel might worsen food supply in the southern African country. State Security Minister Didiamus Mutasa, who is also in charge of food security, criticized the U.S. attitude in an interview with the official Herald newspaper on Monday. Mutasa was not available for comment on Monday, but he said that the shortages were a result of a severe foreign currency crunch resulting from hostile Western economic policies, which Mugabe's government frequently describes as sanctions. Mugabe's critics say government policies, including the land seizures, are to blame for the country's 6-year economic recession, shown in shortages of foreign exchange, fuel, food, unemployment, and triple-digit inflation. Analysts say black farmers who benefited from the land reform lack the necessary skills to undertake intensive commercial agriculture and are ill-prepared due to a lack of funding and farming supplies.
The views expressed on Mosaic are not those of Link TV or its sponsors, but of the broadcasters themselves. Mosaic is made possible by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which promotes journalism excellence worldwide and invests in the vitality of 26 U.S. communities, and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Additional support is provided by the Firedoll Foundation and Henry and Virgilia Dakin.